All right, we're just going to give another moment for everybody to get into the space. All right, people are still coming in, so give us a moment. Okay, so because it's 6:34 and I'm, if not on time, early was how I was brought up. And so for those of you who were on time, I want to reward that. And thank you for spending this secular day of love with all of us this evening. I can think of no better date on my part than Rabbi Kulak. So I'm honored that he would want to spend this Valentine's Day with me. Thank you, Jessica, for lending him. And thank you, Nashville, for joining us. So we always like to start by saying thank you to West End and to Micah for being here with us and anybody else from our Nashville Jewish community. And thank you to the Jewish Federation for supporting the series on American Jewish identity. We are now in year, I don't know what, 2, 3, 4. The pandemic made it 2. Okay, Rabbi Kulak says 2 of this. And you never hesitate to rise to the occasion and learn from some of the rabbis around the country that we are most interested in conversing with. And tonight is no exception. We are very delighted to welcome and thank Rabbi Sharon Brous for being with us all the way from my hometown of Los Angeles. And many of you know Rabbi Brous, have read her writings, heard her speak. She, and I am quoting directly from the ICAR website, which is the synagogue community where Rabbi Brous lives and thrives in Los Angeles, but she is a leading voice in reanimating religious life in America and working to develop a spiritual roadmap for a soulful, definitely justice-driven and multi-faith ethos in Los Angeles. So Rabbi Brous is a senior and founding member, founding rabbi of ICAR, which is a community that launched in 2004 to reinvigorate Jewish practice and inspire people of faith to reclaim a moral and prophetic voice. And honestly, ICAR became one of the fastest growing and most influential Jewish congregations in the country, is just a wonderful, I think Rabbi Brous is a wonderful resource to all of us. I can say unabashedly, I've quoted her more often than I can probably count. And we're just delighted to have her with us tonight. So thank you, Rabbi Brous. Feel free to unmute and we're going to jump right into this.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Rice and Rabbi Kulak. It's great to be with you and with this beautiful community. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Okay. Well, Rabbi Kulak, will you give Rabbi Brous a sense of what it is we've been doing in these conversations and why we asked her to be with us? I mean, we obviously communicated with her in advance, but a reminder is helpful.
Yeah, so during the last few years, what we have been doing in this wonderful culture of cooperation over competition that we have here in Nashville, Tennessee, a Reform congregation, a conservative congregation, we come together and we try to interview wonderful thinkers and people who inspire us. Or in case of Rabbi Brous, she's the rabbi of my rabbi. So it's like she's my rabbi by association, I guess, or whatever. Which is Rabbi Brad Artson. And the idea is to have a conversation surrounding the big chunks of issues regarding American or contemporary American Judaism, what's going on with anti-Semitism from the right, from the left, what is going on right now with Israel, which is certainly challenging. But what we usually do in each and every one of these conversations that we have had is to invite our guests to offer in front of us some sort of a SWOT, according to your view. What would be the strengths and the weaknesses, the opportunities and the threats facing contemporary American Jews and contemporary American Judaism as we speak? That's all you. It's like, yeah, we don't go with like very, the pleasantries and whatever. No, we know that time is very valuable, and we want to learn as much as we can from you. So yes, it's like there won't be any how are you doing questions just jumping into.
Favorite flavor of ice cream and a SWOT analysis, please, of the Jewish American landscape.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll give you my initial instincts. First of all, it's very meaningful to be together. So thank you for having me. And several members of our team in the last couple of years during COVID moved to Tennessee. So I feel like we're kind of extended family over there.
And we're glad to have taken Andrea from you. So sorry about that.
Yes, well, she is one of our favorites. And I spent the summer in Chattanooga once, so I feel a little bit. I know the lay of the land over there. So I'll give you my on one foot for the SWOT analysis, and then I hope that we can be in conversation about these different elements. So and I'm a novice at SWOT analysis, so bear with me for a moment. But it sounds like everybody here is probably familiar with this discourse of SWOT. Is that right? Is it
strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats? But frankly, you can riff on that. It doesn't have to be that.
Okay. So a SWOT analysis of the progressive Jewish space, of the conservative and reform and Reconstructionist landscape in America today. So I'll give you a couple of instincts to start this conversation. The first is that I believe that a great strength that we have in the non-Orthodox movements is that there is a really profound hunger in America today for justice-driven, faith-based communities where people can experience a real alignment between our core values and our practice, especially as they manifest within communities. I think that's actually probably the greatest strength that progressive Judaism can offer today. So an alignment between values and practice as made manifest in the context of community. And I'll come back to the idea of community in a moment or two. One of the weaknesses is that sometimes, as we've seen, a lack of sense of obligation, I think, leads to a variety of practice within our communities. So, for example, we hear often, I showed up, but nobody invited me for Shabbos lunch. So, like, what is, how is that even possible? Or there's a wonderful couple in our community who they came from the Orthodox world, and when her beloved father died, she said they had just made the move over to Ikar, and she said, 20 people from Ikar showed up for Shiva that night, but 200 people from the Orthodox synagogue they used to belong to showed up for Shiva that night. And before they showed up for Shiva, they entered the house, they filled it with lasagnas. There was a sense of communal responsibility, which I will come back to this idea of community. But I think that there is that perhaps the W in the SWOT analysis, the weakness is that sometimes the lack of sense of obligation, lack of shared language around obligation might leave us without a strong sense of what actually binds us to one another and what our shared obligations are, not only to God or in practice, but actually to one another. In terms of opportunities, the O in the SWOT analysis, we could spend all of our time talking about this if you would like. I actually just wrote a book about this, which will come out next year in January. I took a sabbatical starting last spring for 6 months, and this is what my deep dive was into this space, the space that I would put in the O of our analysis, which is we are living in a time in which people are lonely and isolated and reacting to a highly polarized and increasingly violent public square, in which we have a very profound need for human connection and for community and for a shared sense of purpose. And the opportunity for us is that our communities can actually provide people a lot of what I think the times lead us to need. And so I'm happy to dive more into that as Rabbi Rice and Rabbi Kalik, as we connect. And finally, to the question of threats, to the T in the analysis, there are many. I mean, first, there's, I think, anti-Semitism and the growing rise of anti-Semitism in America. I believe that Charlottesville in 2017 was absolutely a tipping point in terms of anti-Semitism in America, when we really saw these anti-Semitic voices and forces move from the margins into the mainstream in a way that I do not believe my grandparents could ever have imagined would happen. I recently listened to Rachel Maddow's podcast called Ultra. I don't know if did any of you hear this podcast? She really does a deep dive into anti-Semitic forces in America, to neo-Nazi forces in America in the late 30s and early 40s. And it's quite striking to note the similarities between some of those voices and the centrality of some of those voices, including in the American political system, and some of what we have seen in the last few years in America. I think that the rise of anti-Semitism is real and is profoundly dangerous and needs to be taken seriously, and we have to be vigilant to it. It is also not the single greatest threat that American Jews need to confront today. And I think that anti-Semitism is very deeply connected to that great threat, which is the threat of real anti-democratic forces in America, which is connected to the mainstreaming of white nationalism in America and white supremacist forces in America, and the real fear of what a true multiracial democracy will look like in this country. All of this is connected because, of course, anti-Semitism is a form of racism, though it manifests very differently than other forms of racism, including anti-Black racism in America. And we can certainly talk more about that. And I believe that the growing extremism of Israel's government is also a very real threat to our American Jewish community. And I believe very strongly that if we don't lead with our values, and if we don't use our voices now to stand up and to speak out for who we are and for the concerns that we have about what's unfolding over there, then our community is in grave danger of disappearing. I think that our continued existence is dependent on us using our moral voices to speak out against injustice, both in this country and in the state of Israel and around the world, and to do so from a foundational commitment to Jewish text, Jewish history, and Jewish tradition. So that's my on one foot SWOT analysis, and I hope it gives us a little bit of fodder for discussion today.
I mean, I just think it gave us nothing to talk about. You just didn't touch on anything that had any kind of depth to it. So, okay, Rabbi Kolek, I'm going to launch in here if I can, because I think there's so many entry points for going deeper, and you pointed those out along the way. I'm going to start with one that kind of was earlier on in your SWOT, which is this topic of obligation and commandedness, because, you know, it was interesting. This last week, when we were engaging in Torah study with our sixth graders and their families, we were looking at the Ten Commandments, and we had this whole conversation about, you know, why is there such a negative reaction, a negative knee-jerk reaction to this notion of being commanded? And we kind of went around the room, and people got to say like what it is that they just feel is so negative about it. And then we talked about like what could be the positives of being obligated or being commanded. But it's always flown in the face of what it means to be an American, right? Like this emphasis on autonomy as kind of our pride and joy, and but how our community suffers when we don't feel this it's the freedom to rather than the freedom from kind of thing. But, you know, it's interesting because I think that as we come out of this COVID phase where we realized that we could do so much from home. We could do our jobs from home, not all of us, but many of us. We could do our, in the South, they say we could do our church from home, but we could do our Judaism from home, our synagogue from home, virtual learning, live stream services. I just wonder now, as we are back into this kind of hybrid mode of some people want to be back in person, some people want to engage, continue to engage in this sort of virtual experience, how that notion of commandedness gets even further away from us. Because we won't have that same inclination necessarily to bring the lasagnas to the Shiva. Does that make sense?
Right. So I think you're asking a really interesting question, and let me make sure that I'm getting this right.
Yeah, please, because I don't know if I even asked the question.
Well, essentially that during COVID, when we were forced into isolation, we were necessarily separated from one another. And now that we're able to come back to each other, if we don't feel obligated to return to each other, so then what will be the glue that holds community together in a time when now we know something that none of us in our lifetime knew before, which is that for literally 18 months to 2 years, we could completely cut off social contact with other human beings, right? So given that we now know that we have done that, and in fact, in some ways, we built the muscles for that kind of isolation. If we're not pulled back into the public space, into the communal space by way of obligation, then what does pull us back? Am I understanding you right?
Yeah, and I'm going to add one more thing to that, if I could, just to layer it on, that this notion of anti-Semitism, I think prior to Charlottesville, we were living in this time of kind of hyper-emancipation, right? Where that's what Danny Schiff calls it, this like notion of we didn't feel othered. We felt very like free to kind of move about in all circles. And so we didn't feel the same need, the same obligation or the same need for community, I think. And now that's not necessarily the case, but the question is, how long lasting is it? And what does it say if it's the negative force from without that causes us to feel like we need to connect with each other?
Oh, okay. So I think there are 8 questions in one.
Probably true. Go anywhere you want.
We'll take them one at a time. I'll try to address this. So, what happens if there's no negative force pushing the Jewish people together? What will, if anything, hold us together is one really good question about the role that anti-Semitism plays in actually building Jewish community. By the way, we had an experience at Ikar that I wonder if you also had in Nashville, in which the Shabbos after the Tree of Life shooting, we had more people that Friday night than we've ever had for any other non-High Holy Day Friday night. So in other words, literally 4 times the size crowd. We couldn't fit everybody that we had because there was something that was stirred up in the Jewish soul that said, if someone's going to walk into a synagogue and God forbid start murdering Jews, I'm going to show up at synagogue now. And my friend, Professor David Myers, who's the head of the history department at UCLA, wrote a little book. It's probably right here somewhere. He wrote a short book called, I think it's called like A Short History of the Jewish People. And he makes the surprising assertion that there are 2 great forces that have sustained the Jewish people throughout history. One of them is assimilation, and one of them is anti-Semitism. Okay, so this might be completely, you should have fallen off your chair just now. So, I almost did when I first read this. One of them is assimilation, because he says wherever Jews have gone throughout history, we have acclimated to the environments and the cultures that we've been in. We have learned the languages, we've learned the skills, we've learned how to navigate our way through the social and political environments in order to be safe for some amount of time. But the second force is anti-Semitism, because we've never been truly safe, never been fully safe. So even if we could be safe for 100 years or 200 years, at some point, the forces of anti-Semitism have again risen. and have left us in a very precarious and threatened environment. And so somehow the push-pull of assimilation and anti-Semitism has actually led to the survival of the Jewish people for literally thousands of years. So take it or leave it. I found that to be a very interesting and compelling argument that he made. So, but Rabbi Rice, back to your, so to one of your questions about what is the pull toward Jewish life when there isn't a great threat of anti-Semitism in our culture. When I remember my first year in college, when the spokesperson from the Nation of Islam, Khalid Muhammad, was invited to come and speak on campus. And I wanted to go hear his talk because he was speaking about the death of Malcolm X. And I was really interested in hearing what the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam would have to say about the death of Malcolm X, because it certainly seemed from Malcolm X's autobiography that he believed that it was the Nation of Islam that was going to assassinate him. So I was very curious. And I remember approaching young Jewish student, New York City, new to school. And I approached the Ferris Booth Hall where they were holding this lecture. And there were hundreds of Jews outside protesting, saying that this man was an anti-Semite and that he had no place speaking on our college campus. And what happened was, and by the way, he was an anti-Semite. I was embarrassed at first. I thought, like, why are the Jews protesting? We're here. It's a college campus. I want to learn from him. Let's see what he has to say. And I literally walked out after 5 or 6 minutes of his talk because he wasn't talking about the death of Malcolm X. He was doing Holocaust denial. And I was so affronted, and I'd never experienced anything like this. I was 17 years old, living alone for my first time in my life, and actually hearing someone on the stage talking about the so-called Holocaust, which was absolutely devastating for me. And I realized I didn't have to stay, and I stormed out of the room. And what I noted, though, was that there were 1,000 students who were listening to him and taking very seriously what he was saying. Anyway, so a couple weeks before this happened, it happened to have been on Kristallnacht, the night that he came to speak in November. A few weeks before that, it was Simchat Torah. It was the end of the holidays. And on Simchat Torah, something really interesting happened in my college campus, which, by the way, was 25% Jewish then and now, which is nobody showed up. And so a young college student wrote an open letter to the Jewish community, and he put it in the mailbox of every student who had a Jewish name. So I didn't get one, but a lot of my friends got them, so I read them. I guess he didn't know about the Brous family tradition, and so I saw this letter, and he basically said, "What does it say about us as a people that 400 or 500 or 600 Jews will show up in front of Ferris Booth Hall to protest against an anti-Semite, but 6 Jews and a Sefer Torah show up on Simchat Torah? Yeah. What does that say about our people? That we're so much more activated by the danger of anti-Semitism than we are by the joy of Jewish life." Yeah. This was a profound lesson for me. My first year in college, I wasn't even 18 years old. And I realized how right this student was. And it actually really helped me on my Jewish journey to try to seek out opportunities for not fear-driven Jewish engagement, but for a Jewish engagement that's rooted in love, that's rooted in hope, that is an expression of our core values, that is an expression of a kind of moral clarity that, again, derives from or is derived from our Jewish history and from our Torah. And it forced me to contend with the easy answer of anti-Semitism as an activator. And while I was thrilled that so many people showed up for Shul, the Shabbos after Tree of Life, because I felt that we could comfort each other, what I actually wanted was for them to show up the next Shabbos and the next Shabbos and the next, so that we could actually build community that's rooted not just in fear and not just in defiance of the neo-Nazis who now have an outsized platform in America, but actually to show up out of love, out of a sense of commitment, out of a sense of connection. And that, I believe, is one of the great, I would say, challenges and opportunities in our American Jewish life today. I answered only one of your eight
You know what?
questions.
It was great. And I'm going to say thank you. And I'm going to ask Rabbi Kolek if he wants to jump in.
Yeah, the truth is that when you were talking about what happened after the shooting at the Tree of Life, it brought me back when I was 14. I was 13. I was in Argentina. That's from where I carry my accent. Or people say I have an accent. I don't know. It's like people in Nashville already, don't notice it anymore. But I remember that first Shabbat after the bombing of the Jewish center that killed 84, 85 people. And every synagogue was like, filled with folks. I was just a bar mitzvah boy or something like that. And again, very similar insight in terms of how our brain is modeled so that we are triggered by the things that we fear the most. And so we are quick to react, but it's harder for us to be proactive in engaging with our tradition or whatnot. So along those lines, it's like what I wanted to ask you is, how can we develop, and it's connected to the commandedness that we were talking before, how can we develop a language of the mitzvah, but not only to address these values regarding social justice and all this work that is universal and, following Heschel, it connects us all, whether we are Jewish or not. On that deep theology, we are all hopefully working to see a better world, a more just world. But how we develop a language of the mitzvah that addresses the particular, or if you want, what would be the role of the particular in this development of the language of the mitzvah to bring us back or to bring us together in this sense of doing universal work, but from our place as Jews.
Right. So I believe that the best way to be a universalist is to be a particularist. Right. So, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has written so beautifully about this, that you learn to love by loving someone, not by loving everyone. Right. And so you honor the human dignity by honoring a human's dignity. And so I really believe that our mitzvot are a particular language to help us be better universalists, to help us care more deeply and invest more deeply in the redemption, in the transformation and the redemption of the world. So I will tell you that in progressive or non-Orthodox Jewish communities, we often only speak that language of duty when it comes to feeding the hungry, right? When it comes to those issues of social justice, we talk about duty, but we don't talk about duty when it comes to either practice like Shabbat or Kashrut, or when we're talking about what it means to actually show up for one another in community. And this is actually the book, the essence of the book that I wrote, which is I realized at some point about 10 years into building Ikar, that if we dream of building the beloved community out in the world, meaning if we dream of building a society that, as Dr. King envisioned it, is rooted in human dignity and justice and equity and equality for all people, if we dream of a world in which no parent has to put their child to bed hungry, and nobody has to fear that their child might not make it home from school safely because there's a shooter in Michigan State yesterday, or, by the way, I don't know if you saw, one of the survivors of the shooting yesterday was a Sandy Hook survivor. A child who was crouched down in the classroom in Sandy Hook, who now is a college student at Michigan State University, and now experienced what she did yesterday. If we believe that part of our work as Jews, that part of the vision of Tikkun is actually envisioning and then creating a world in which that doesn't happen anymore, then the way to start doing that is by building the beloved community inside our homes and inside our communities with each other. And so for the first 10 years of Ikar, we really took to the streets a lot, and we were fighting the genocide in Darfur, and we were fighting against we were fighting the homelessness crisis here in Los Angeles, and we were fighting for immigrants to be able to. We were trying to help pass some kind of comprehensive immigration reform. We were fighting locally and statewide and nationally. And what I realized was, after 10 years, I had never given one sermon talking to our community about our obligations to each other, about what it means to actually show up at Annette's Shiva when her father dies, which her former Orthodox synagogue talked about all the time. So they all knew to go, but we didn't know.
Yeah.
And so what we ended up doing was using this language of obligation and of duty to talk about the obligation to actually love each other. And that's part of the work of building a redeemed world. And I'll share with you that there's a piece that came out in the New Yorker just today that was written by an incredible writer, a young guy I know called Matthew Schnipper. You can probably find his piece at some point. He writes about music, and he's an incredible writer. And his son, a boy named Renzo, died very suddenly and very tragically last year. And I know him because we're in this network of Jewish artists and activists and thinkers. And he wrote to this group and he said, my sweet boy died, and I just want you to know that he existed in the world. And he put a picture of Renzo. And so we tried to coordinate how we could help this family walk through this terrible tragedy. And we ended up it was in the peak Omicron, if you remember, last December. And we created some virtual rituals for him. And he writes this piece about the virtual Shivas and what it meant to say Kaddish through on the screen. So Rabbi Rice, this is also connecting back to your question. And I'm going to read you the sentence that he writes in the piece that just, I feel captures the very essence of this, of what we're talking about here. He says, comforting the other offered a primal sense of purpose. Love was now about duty. Love was now about duty. And so essentially showing up for each other in these moments of crisis, and I would argue in moments of celebration, in moments of sorrow, and in moments of joy, is actually also about duty and about obligation. We just don't often talk about it that way. But actually dancing at someone else's chuppah is an act of obligation and an act of commitment to building a beloved community right there under the chuppah, so that the presence of that kind of holiness can reverberate out and hopefully help manifest a beloved community more broadly. Rabbi Rice, I see your.
Yeah, no, I first of all, get very excited about the things that you share, but just this notion of, we're really only commanded to love God. The commands that are towards one another in our Torah are ones of duty and of act in that way. I think of like Elu Devarim from our morning prayers, this notion that is how we in fact show our love for the divine and our love for one another. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it is a case for obligation and for duty for sure. But I am thinking about a piece that I read. It's from a congregational consulting sort of listserv that I get, and it's geared more often towards churches, but a lot of it is applicable to the synagogue world as well. And one of the things that they were saying in the recent article was that synagogues, churches, they've rarely been good at defining and measuring the changes that they want to see in their members' lives. But if we can get clear about those changes, and if we're successful in creating them, it shouldn't matter when our members are in the building. What will matter is that they're living the lives they've been called to live and doing the work they've been called to do. And I still feel like there's this rub between doing the work you're meant to do in the world and what you're talking about, building the beloved community within the walls of our community. And we can say that, we're two synagogue communities here on this Zoom, but we are a Nashville Jewish community, and we're small enough that we behave that way. A shiva for one is not just from that one congregational community. We're very blessed that there's a lot of ties between folks, regardless of their synagogue affiliation here in this community. But I do think there's value to that it's not just about what is your own sort of personal spiritual pursuit out in the world. That's not enough. There is this element of obligation to others, to showing up, physically showing up, that I think is compelling. So I'm just giving an exclamation point to what you've been saying.
Well, I mean, I think that's the very heart of life itself. I think that human beings are meant to live dialogically, that we manifest the best of ourselves when we're in relationships, and that we know from neuroscientists and from social scientists and from people, from clergy, that we are hardwired for connection. Right? The science here meshes with the Torah insight. When God says, Lo tov heyot adam levado, it's not good for a person to be alone. And it doesn't mean it's not good to be single. It means it's not good to live fundamentally out of relationship. And that relationship can be with a dear friend. Mm-hmm. It can be with a therapist. It can be with a minion. There's a reason why we organize in groups of 10, because it forces us into community with each other. There's a reason that when our hearts are broken, we cannot, according to Jewish law, properly grieve without each other. That we need each other because when we stand up and say, Yitkadal v'yikadash shemei Rabbah, we need to hear a community respond, Amen. Yeah. And so the power of that interaction, of that conversation and discourse is at the very heart of life itself. And this is why, by the way, you'll see, all the studies show that people live longer when they're connected to faith communities, right? And not only do they live longer, but they have more health and wellness. They show they rank higher on the happiness index, on the mental well-being, on the physical well-being. There's something about being connected to each other. And I don't think it's just faith communities. I think it's also book groups, and it's also political action groups. But when we find ourselves in dialogue with other people, we are able to manifest a fuller humanity than we can when we're in isolation from each other. So to connect back to what you were saying earlier about, COVID, when we were, there's a major price that we're paying as a collective, as a human community, for the isolation that we experienced during COVID. And these little boxes were lifesavers, because this allowed us to actually see each other's, and to see each other's eyes and smiles and faces in a time when without it, the damage would have been even worse. But even still, we're really seeing the toll of it right now, that there's more anxiety, depression, suicidality in all age groups as a result of what we've all just experienced collectively. The isolation is not it's not natural for human beings. And so we were kind of pushed away from each other. And I think we're naturally inclined to find our way back to each other. And the question right now is, so how do we do that? Once people are habituated to isolation, how do you get them back into community? Is it free pizza? Like, what do we do to get people to come back for the better oneg cookies? I think that that's part of your question, and the answer is we have to do all different kinds of things. We have to do anything and everything in order to help connect back with people in real life, now that it's safer for us to do so. I think it starts small. I think it starts with house parties, with doing small gatherings in people's homes, wine and cheese and Torah. I think that in my experience at Ikarim, we do these house parties every single week for 19 years. People are much more comfortable going into someone's living room and having a glass of wine than they are going to a synagogue on Saturday morning. And so if we can start to help people reestablish connection in smaller, more intimate ways, then I think people start to open up again and will find their way back into the shared space.
It's I keep thinking about this. There is some paradoxical nature of particularism that, at times it can become a little bit like sama chaim or sama mavet. It can be what in Greek is pharmakon. It could heal you or it could kill you, depending on how you use it. But so we have seen the ugly face of particularism that happens every time it is associated with supremacy. So we see it here, we see it in Israel, we see it in so many other places. But interestingly enough, or paradoxically enough, the best way for not only a beloved community, but a beloved country, or a country that makes room for everybody, is not by diluting the differences, but by doubling down on the development of particular communities of folks, in which the value is to learn how to celebrate what we have in common and to respect what we have different.
Yes.
There is always, between the pull and the push that you were talking about, anti-Semitism and assimilation. I think that even in the discourse of the national state, there is always a push for everybody to be exactly the same,
Sure.
and to erase the differences, and doubling on the differences without falling in the trap of the supremacy, which is tricky because we see how many people fall into that trap. Might be connected in how do we develop a love for somebody that is very particular, but at the same time create the conditions for the whole country to learn and to accept and to embrace different groups of people with different practices, as long as we share some common values, right? But my question to you here would be, and you said it just a moment ago, you said wine and cheese and Torah. What would be the role of Jewish learning in all of these, program for the beloved community that you talk about?
Well, I'll tell you, when we started the community here in LA in 2004, the way that we started, actually, I wrote a mission statement. I wrote what I dreamt would be possible for Jewish life and shared it with a few friends who shared it with a few friends. And I said to people, if this interests you, let's meet on Friday night. And the mission statement was really simple. It basically said, in a time of religious extremism, we have to be equally committed to manifesting religious creativity. In a time of hatred, we have to manifest love. In a time of so much human suffering, we have to be the bearers of healing, right? Something like that. And we put it out to the community, and a lot of people showed up on Friday night. 135 people showed up on Friday night. And we were so stunned. And I realized a couple of things. One, that this was a resonant idea, that people wanted to be in communities of purpose with each other. And two, that we were never going to build a real community if there were always 135 people in the room, that we had to actually know each other. And so immediately, at the recommendation of a guy here in our community named Gary Wexler. I don't know if any of you have ever encountered Gary Wexler, creative guy in the community. And Gary said, you should do house parties in the spirit of moveon.org. It was 2004. So I don't know if you remember, but they were trying to get neighbors who shared political interests to come together. So they were kind of organizing by zip code. And so we started to do these little house parties. And the way that I did them was, I said that I asked in services, who here is willing to offer your home for a small, intimate gathering of Jewish learning and community? And literally like 9 or 12 people raised their hands immediately that they were willing to host. I'll host in this neighborhood. I'll host in that neighborhood. And so I told people that we wanted no more than the number of people who could comfortably fit in your living room, and that they should have the spots. If they had 12 spots, for example, 6 of them should be their friends who are not at all connected to the community, and 6 of them would be open up to the ICAR growing email list. And so it was a combination of people, some of whom knew each other and some didn't. And I said to the host, what is the pressing moral question that you and your friends are struggling with today, related to Judaism or theology or not? And then I built a text study around that. And then people would come in, and we would spend the first half of the house party, everyone would grab a pizza and a beer and come sit down, and people would introduce themselves. Who are you and what brings you here? What's your story? What's your Jewish story? And then the other half, I would share a text, and it would be in some way a reflection of how I believed that Judaism could help us address some of the most compelling and challenging questions that we ask in our lives, whether those are questions about, I remember someone asked early on, how could God let the tsunami happen? Right? That's a theological question. I remember there was one house party where someone said, I'm turning 30 and I'm still single. What does it mean? Right? Which is not necessarily a Jewish question. My parents are at a really challenging age, and so are my kids. Where do my responsibilities go first? So what I would do is just try to help people understand that Jewish texts and tradition could be the lens through which they not only connect with each other, but also help to see their lives, right? That there's ancient wisdom to help us process some of the challenges that we're experiencing in our own lives. And so so what's the role of Torah study in all of this? We became a community that was bound together through addressing the serious questions that we have and looking to Judaism as a wellspring of knowledge and ideas and discourse that could help us engage those most difficult and greatest challenges that we have.
Rabbi Brous, I know we only have about 10 more minutes, and I haven't opened it to anybody in the Zoom classroom, but I do want to ask one more question, and I fear that the question I ask is we probably don't have enough time to get into, so please do say. But one thing that you touched on in your opening sort of SWAT dive was how important it is for us as an American Jewish community to be organizing and to raise our voice around what we see is going on in Israel today. And I have a sense, and this is with my third child in Israel right now for the semester and a group from our congregation heading there in June. I just have a sense that so many Americans, and certainly so many American Jews, are so tired politically from what we've gone through in our own country over the last 4, 5, 6+ years, that there's not a lot of energy and fuel in the tank left to even manage thinking about, discussing, and organizing around what's going on in Israel. It's not a complacency and it's not a defeatism. It's just, I think, an exhaustion. And I'm curious if you see that, and if there's a way to, I would be thrilled to have the voices lifted, but I'll take it a step back. I would be happy just to not lose engagement or support for or interest in Israel. And I just think people are tired. So I'm curious if you have something to say about that.
Well, I think that's a generous read that people are just tired. I mean, yes, we're tired, right? We're exhausted. This has been a kind of spiritual whiplash. Every day of the last several years has been another crisis. And I wake up before my husband does each morning. And so I'm just sitting there waiting for him to wake up so that he says, okay, tell me what the 5 things are that you need to share with me. And I'm like, oh my God, there was a shooting in Michigan State and there were 250,000 people outside of Bibi's house. And they're like, we've had it's so much. Yeah. It's so much. And it's hard for the spirit. And that's why we need Shabbat. And thank God we have it every single week.
Right.
I don't think it's just exhaustion, though. I think that there are really good reasons why American Jews are reluctant to engage in the conversation about what we see as a real and growing danger in Israel. And I think part of it has to do with a growing anti-Semitism and our desire to not fuel anti-Semitism. And I think part of it is because we feel like we don't really have a right to talk about what's going on over there because it's not our kids who are on the front lines, even though many of us, I imagine I'm not the only one with immediate family members who live there. I think that there's a real reluctance and resistance to talk about it for some very good reasons and for some bad reasons. Yeah. One of the bad reasons is that we've been trained over the course of the last 20 or 30 years that we don't have that right to speak. And if we have spoken out and voiced our concerns, we've been fought very, I think, ferociously in the public space by people who are the protectors of Israel's image, and that's been really to the detriment of this American Jewish community and the relationship between Israel and American Jews. Right now, yesterday, there were somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 Israeli Jews who stood in front of the prime minister's home on a Monday. They took off of work from the tech, high tech industry in Tel Aviv, and they got on the train and they came up to Jerusalem, and they protested. The Saturday night before that, there were 250,000 Israeli Jews across the country who did that. The week before that, there were more than 100,000 on Saturday night who did that. There is a population of Israelis that are crying out and begging us, American Jews, to help them stop the train from going off the edge of the cliff here. And they're fighting desperately to save democracy there and to fight for Jewish values there. And we don't do them any service by staying quiet about it. I think that our job is not to get ahead of our Israeli brothers and sisters here, but to amplify their voices, to amplify the voices of Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians who live in the occupied territories, and to speak as an American Jewish community on behalf of a safe and just and peaceful future for our family and for our neighbors. I think that that's actually our responsibility as American Jews. So I know that we might be exhausted, we might be scared, but I believe that we have to use our voices and our resources to actually support the people who are fighting for Israel's democracy. We're so proud as American Jews, we're so proud of Israel and Israeli democracy. And you hear American Jews talk all the time. It's the only democratic country in the region. We're about to lose our democracy there. And if we don't use our voices to speak out about it, if we don't use our voices to speak out against the racism, the homophobia, the overt ultra-nationalist agenda that's there, I believe that the Israel that's emerging will be unrecognizable to us. And it's going to break our hearts, and it's going to break our community. And so I say this with all the love in my heart. And I'm a person who, I will say pre-COVID, would go to Israel at least twice a year. My family lives there. It is also my spiritual home, and that's exactly why I feel I need to fight for there to be a just and shared society there, so that we can actually have a future, so that my children who grew up in love with Israel can actually go to that place and either visit or move to a place that is really in alignment with our Jewish and democratic values.
As a quick follow-up, so what is it possible to make a case for Israel? Or if you want, it's like, because I feel like we all have this, it's a prophetic nature of, when Moses is speaking to the Israelites, there is like, don't do. But then when he's speaking with God, says, but they are good people and whatever. So it's like, as a rabbi, as a communal leader, as a voice that is heard, it's like, do you have any room to make a case for Israel, especially during these very challenging times, for those young folks or girls who are losing their connection with Israel? Because all of us suffer because we grew up in love with Israel, but it doesn't necessarily happen in many people that are younger than we are. And the question is, how can we make a case to them about why should we care for Israel?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think the answer there is not to try to sell them on the fantasy of Israel, but inspire them to be part of helping realize the dream of Israel, if that makes sense. So we had two speakers come to Ikar a couple of weeks ago. A guy named Alon Lee Green. He's the grandson of a Shoah survivor, Holocaust survivor, lives in Tel Aviv, a secular Israeli Jew, and a woman named Sally Abed, who's a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And they came to speak at Ikar. They are the leaders of an organization called Omdim Biachad, Standing Together. And they both spoke about why they believe that they, as neighbors, need to work together to build Israeli society. And it was the most inspiring, most hopeful, most beautiful vision of Israel that I could offer my community. And it wasn't a made up, let's go to, like, let's go on a hike at En Gedi and see how beautiful it is and watch the sunrise over Masada. That's a beautiful tourist vision of Israel. But at the end of the day, we have to be part of supporting the building of a society that's actually rooted in our Jewish values, which is rooted in loving the stranger, loving the ger, not oppressing the ger, creating one system of law that applies to everybody, building a true just society, as our Torah would command us to. And so we can have our kids fall in love with Israel with these free trips. And, my kids did fall in love with Israel that way. And we took them to Israel again. I mean, at least my kids have been there. They're teenagers and they've been to Israel 10 to 15 times already. Like we're diehard. We're really serious about this commitment. Brought them every year almost. And they fell in love with the hikes and with the shuk and with the marzipan from the Jerusalem shuk. But the fact is, at some point, they had to know that this is a very complex reality in which Jews and Palestinians have very different rights and very different dignities. And our responsibility as committed Jews who love Israel and who understand Jewish history and understand something about democracy is to be part of helping to create a different kind of reality in which Israel can actually flourish the way that those 150,000 protesters actually want the state of Israel to flourish.
Yeah. I mean, just as you were speaking, Rabbi, a friend of mine who was obviously up very late in the middle of the night in Israel sent an article from Haaretz about how they want to criminalize immodest dress at the Kotel and forbid non-Orthodox prayer. So this is not just an issue of, the ger, it's also like that liberal or progressive Jews become the ger as well. And that will be another frightening aspect of what we see developing. We did not leave time for questions and comments from the group. I feel like we could talk for a whole nother hour, but we do want to respect your time. And we're so grateful that you took the time to be with us. And we hope that we'll be able to invite you again and that you'll share with us. I know she's pretty remarkable, so you can go ahead and quiet applaud in your Zoom spaces. But we're just grateful to have you with us, and we'll look forward to sharing your book. I hope you'll let our community know when it's available.
Yes,
and maybe come back and for a reading and share with us then would be quite lovely.
I would love it. It's coming out in January 2024. So it's at the copy editor now, and I would be so thrilled to come back and share it with all of you, maybe even in person. So thank you. And it's really been wonderful to be with you. And thank you, Rabbi Kolik and Rabbi Rice. I'm very honored by the invitation.
Thank you so
much. We're so glad to have you. Rabbis, both of you, if you'll stay for just 1 second so we can say a proper thank you and goodbye, but we're going to say goodnight to everybody else. And have a good a safe rest of your week. And we'll hope to see you on Shabbat, everybody. Shavua Tov.